Hello, folks. Welcome to another edition of Israel Explained. We have a lot to get to today. Mostly, we're going to be talking about the advances that have been made in the last few days towards ceasefire in the war and the possibility of having a ceasefire before Ramadan. So, as we speak, there's an Israeli delegation in Paris to discuss a ceasefire agreement or a hostage release agreement, depending on how you look at it, headed by Dedi Barnea, the head of the Mossad. According to Israeli sources that are involved in the negotiations, quote, there is optimism, but we're only in the early stages. This is an attempt to create criteria for what we're talking about and what we aren't. There's no deal yet, but we are trying to get one before Ramadan. And that's the key. Everyone is trying to get one before Ramadan because Hamas and the Arab states would like it over before then. And Israel has set Ramadan as a deadline by which the hostages will be released, or the IDF is going to enter Rafah. So in Paris, Barnett is going to be having separate meetings with the heads of the CIA, the head of Egyptian intelligence, and the Qatari PM. By all reports, all of them are very committed to getting a deal done and have been pressing both Israel and Hamas to make concessions to narrow the gap between the negotiating sides. And there has, without a doubt, been a lot of progress. On the prisoner issue, it appears that Hamas is demanding a good deal less than they were before. And it's unlikely that that's going to be a sticking point. Israel knows that it's going to have to release major numbers and um, dangerous terrorists, but it looks like the amount is going to actually be lower. Israel is proving very willing to expand humanitarian aid as part of a deal, so that's not likely to be a sticking point. Israel's also made concessions on Gazans returning to the north. Israeli sources are telling me that there are, quote, creative solutions to that are being considered. So that's no longer considered to be a red line. What is still a red line for Israel is that it's not willing to stop fighting until Hamas is defeated. But as we'll see, Hamas is starting to make concessions also on the day after, on whether there'll be a government on the day after, which could allow Israel to stop fighting and say that it's won the war because Hamas is no longer in power. So no matter which metric you look at, there has been movement towards compromise from both sides, showing that both sides now have an interest in reaching that deal. On a political level, there is a lot of support for a deal. Obviously, if the deal addresses Israeli needs in the cabinet. Not only are Gantz and Eisenkot for a deal, but reportedly Aryeh Deri and also Ron Dermer, who is particularly close to Benjamin Netanyahu, are pulling for a deal. They together, those four, have more influence than Ben Gvir and Smotrich and the people who are pushing against a deal. Another reason I think it might happen. Internal reports from the cabinet are also showing that Netanyahu is more supportive of a deal now than he was before, more supportive of a deal than people believed he was earlier. And one sign of that is that he's allowed Barnea to have some negotiating latitude to reach agreements in Paris, and he hadn't allowed them to do that previously in Cairo. So that's another side. Now, I have to say, in this channel, I've been talking a lot about how it's been a mistake not to go into Rafah, and from a military perspective, it's been a terrible mistake. But from a diplomatic perspective, it may actually be working out well because Hamas leadership is left in Rafah, because it's the one place left under their control. In order to save face, they need to protect Rafah from an Israeli invasion. Egypt is incredibly concerned about what happens if Israel goes into Rafah in terms of refugees going into their country. The United States is worried about a humanitarian catastrophe. which also is not good on an election year when they're already losing a lot of people on the left, losing support from some of their allies for being too close to Israel. So there are a lot of threats embodied in that. And of course, if Israel goes into Rafah during Ramadan, that will cause instability all around the Muslim world. So has created a threat that's actually quite effective on everyone involved, and they're pushing Hamas to make concessions, and Hamas wants to make concessions because of Rafah anyway. So could be that's working out surprisingly well. I'm not sure that was planned to begin with. I doubt it, but that is going quite nicely. So Israel set a deadline unless hostages are released by Ramadan, it will go in. That's having a lot of effect. Yesterday, the Israeli government released its day after plan, finally, considering that because of these developments, the day after may be pretty close. It's certainly about time. I translated the entire document on my Twitter if you're interested, but most of it addresses the immediate Israeli security needs rather than any kind of long-term diplomatic scope. It also addresses governance in Gaza in the short term more than it does in the long term. Netanyahu was talking about demilitarized Gaza that will continue to have a very heavy Israeli security presence, buffer zones all across the border, Israeli control of the Egypt-Gaza border to seal off the strip in the south, in cooperation with Egypt, at least they hope. The final part, which talks about a diplomatic horizon for the future, is the shortest part of the plan, which is no coincidence. It talks there about how no unilateral Palestinian state will be accepted, but it doesn't rule out negotiations over a Palestinian state. So it doesn't go directly against the US, UAE, Egyptian ideas, although it doesn't necessarily fully concur with them. But there's a plan there for a Palestinian civil government not affiliated with Hamas, not affiliated with the PA unless it reforms. So no terrorism, a de-radicalization program in education, welfare, culture, etc. And as we said, no clear idea of how and if that would transition to an independent Palestinian state. Hamas, of course, have rejected that document. Osama Hamdan, who's number 3 or 4 in Hamas right now, said, "quote When it comes to the day after in the Gaza Strip, Netanyahu is presenting ideas which he knows fully well will never succeed." The Americans haven't really addressed it directly, but Blinken, while in Brazil, did talk about it indirectly. He said Gaza cannot be a platform for terrorism. There should be no Israeli reoccupation of Gaza. The size of Gaza territory should not be reduced. So the reoccupation is perhaps a hint about continued Israeli presence in Gaza in the long term. And the size of Gaza should not be reduced is definitely referring to the buffer zone of 1 kilometer Israel is putting across its border, something that Israel feels very strongly about. And I don't think they're going to concede to the United States or anyone else about it, understandably, after October 7th, of course. So I think Hamas is eyeing the end of the conflict. They want to um, go into this temporary ceasefire, which Israel is thinking about with a release of hostages and prisoners, trying to turn it into a permanent one. But they're aware of the fact, after the first one didn't do that, that they need to offer Israel some kind of victory if they want Israel to stop the fighting. And that's where the technocratic government comes in. About a week ago, in negotiations between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, Hamas told the PA that they're willing to accept a technocratic government in Gaza. That was repeated a few days ago, 3 days ago, by a Hamas official. Now, I can't stress enough how important this is. Ultimately, this means that Hamas has already conceded and understood that it's lost the war. What they're trying to bargain now is over what terms. How likely is Hamas going to be able to take power back? What kind of influence will have once it loses power? That's what it's looking at now. It's no longer of the belief that it can retain power in Gaza. The PA, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Algeria, a whole bunch host of countries have made it clear to them that they have to remove themselves from Gaza if they want this war to end. That is a massive success for Israel. Doesn't mean the war is over yet, but it means that Israel has the upper hand clearly, because that's the most important issue of the entire war, if you ask me. And the pressure for a ceasefire is also massive in Israel. The talks have gotten the hopes of the families and their supporters up. The families have blocked the Ayalon, the main throughways in Tel Aviv, and set up an empty Shabbat table there while blocking it with signs saying, um, "What if these were your family members?" etc. And I think that the Israeli government, if they turn down a decent deal, certainly won't be perfect, a decent deal which has release of the hostages, it will be very costly domestically. And it may be very costly to U.S. Israeli relations as well. So there's a lot of pressure there as well. And the U.S. Has been shown that it's willing to inflict a cost on Israel. It's been threatening to recognize a Palestinian state unilaterally. It's put some limitations on arms, so far theoretical, with human rights limitations on arms exports. These are things that the Biden administration is setting up to tighten the screws on Israel if necessary. Meanwhile, Qatar and Egypt putting pressure on Hamas. So, with Ramadan coming up, there's a meeting of interests here. And while I don't think there's going to be a deal in the next 2, 3, 4 days, I think that by Ramadan, there is going to be a ceasefire. That ceasefire is going to be a temporary one, most likely. It will involve the release of the most needy hostages in return for some heavy hitting prisoners. It will involve a ceasefire of probably 2 months or so. And then Hamas is going to try to leverage that into a permanent ceasefire, but by making actual concessions. So I think overall, this is a good thing. And I think that we're headed to a ceasefire. I'm taking a chance by saying that because, people can laugh at me in a couple of weeks if I'm wrong, and maybe I am, but I hope I'm not. I hope we have a ceasefire because I think the ceasefire will serve Israeli interests more than it will serve Hamas interests. And of course, an end to the bloodshed and the suffering is very important. Okay, let's look at some questions that we have. Fred always asks a question, and we're very appreciative of that. So Fred says, regarding Rafah, it would seem that it would have made more sense for Israel to take it and the Philadelphia route as a first objective, invading from south, north, and center simultaneously. This would have cut off Hamas from any possible resupply. The IDF knew this, but did not take that path for political reasons. With that in mind, do you think the failure was because the Netanyahu government thought it could pressure Egypt to take a majority of Gazan refugees into Sinai? This would have allowed his more right-wing members like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich to realize their dream of occupying and annexing Gaza. What are your thoughts on this? Yeah, so like you said, and like I've agreed, militarily not taking Rafah was a big mistake because Hamas wouldn't have been able to fight as much as they've been fighting if that had been taken early on because they wouldn't have resupply. So Israel would probably be further along in its military operation. As I said, diplomatically, this seems to have actually worked for the ceasefire. Assuming this ceasefire occurs, that would be one of the major reasons that it did. As for the reason that it didn't go in, no, it's not because of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. There's two major reasons they didn't do this early on. First, the initial plan was bad, not from the IDF's perspective, from the government's perspective. It wasn't really clear where they were going. It wasn't really clear if the IDF was going in to take over all of Gaza. The military didn't know, and the government hadn't decided, so there was that. And of course, there was fear at the Egyptian and American diplomatic reaction if Israel took over the Philadelphia route. Egypt was threatening that it would be the end of the peace agreement and things like that when Israel was talking to them behind the scenes. I don't think the Ben Gvir Smotrich annexation settlement plan really had much of an effect on what Netanyahu was doing, except for that he's trying to tiptoe in order to not piss them off. But I don't think Netanyahu has those kind of insane messianic ideas. And I think that if he can, he would rather avoid doing things that lead to that because he knows ultimately that's not good for Israel. It's not good for his career. Now, usually I get questions from, shall we say, more pro-Israel or more slightly judgmental, slightly more critical people who still support Israel. Today I've gotten some questions that are more hostile, but I decided to take them anyway. One is from an individual called Butrus Najaim. He asked me, why do you keep referring to the prisoners as terrorists? Terrorists is all capitalized. Have they been judged? How many have never had a trial? How many were trialed by military courts? How many teenagers? How many imprisoned for throwing a rock? So first, I want to say that Boutros has a point. Israel's arrested a lot of people on administrative detention that's without trial. Israel's arrested teenagers who haven't really done all that much wrong. Some people have been tried by military courts. I would say that throwing rocks can and has killed people, so it is a form of terrorism. I think Israel has overall been maybe, especially in times of relative peace, been too heavy-handed in who it arrests and how it arrests them and what level of evidence it uses to do that. Having said that, that's not particularly relevant for this hostage deal. What Hamas really wants is the release of individuals who don't fit into any of the categories that you mentioned. People who have been tried in civil courts and convicted of murder on several counts, who are serving several lifetimes, like um, Marwan Barghouti, for example, and several others who are at the top of the list of their demands. The people they mentioned by name are all people who have been convicted by law, civil, for killing people. So that's why I refer to them as terrorists. Probably, if you go through all the list of people that Israel's releasing, there are people who are not fully terrorists, and I'm being unfair to them. But that's generally who they want released. And a lot of the people who are minors and who are less dangerous were already released in the first deal. So now we're talking about people who are more dangerous. And I got a pretty touching question from Omar, who is from Gaza. And I will read that question. And it's a challenging one, or it's a series of questions. Omar says, I'm from Gaza and wrote a full message, but it seems gone now. And I want to assure you, Omar, I didn't delete your question. I don't delete questions. I just have one question. Are you guys happy with the killing of innocents and the starving that is happening? Another question. Do you think it is okay that you destroy Gaza and burn all the houses down? Finally, how do you guys see us? Do you consider us humans or what? Because it doesn't look like it. So I can't really speak for all Israelis. I can speak for myself, and I can speak for what I think the average Israeli thinks. Um, so first of all, I think there are Israelis who see you in a very dehumanizing way. I don't think that's the average Israeli. I personally am very unhappy that innocents are being killed in this war and unhappy if there's starvation, although I'm happy that Israel is letting in humanitarian aid to try to resolve that, and I hope Israel lets in more. I think most of us see the killing of innocents as very unfortunate collateral damage in a battle against terrorism, and that future deaths of civilians can be prevented by not allowing terrorists and extremists to control Palestinian society and to be elected. Um, do you guys think it's okay to destroy Gaza and burn all the houses down? Um, yes, yes. I think that as a response to October 7th and to the threat that Hamas presents to Israel, we feel that the IDF needs to do what it has to in order to destroy the threat of Hamas. I don't think it's okay to target and kill people or houses that are not necessarily military targets, so they're not needed for that, just for their own sake. But if there are buildings that Hamas is using, if there are buildings that are hiding tunnels, I think that it's important to destroy them in order to get there. I also think it's Israel's responsibility, along with the international community, to rebuild them, to rebuild Gaza to be better and more prosperous than it was before. Finally, do you consider us as humans or what? Because it doesn't look like it. I want to assure you that we feel the Palestinians are just as human as we are. We find it incredibly regrettable that this war causes pain to innocent civilians. We don't regret that it's causing pain to Hamas, but we do to innocent civilians. And one of the major reasons that I want peace and a lot of other Israelis want peace is so that the Palestinian people don't have to suffer like this. And the sooner Palestinians give up terrorism, and the sooner Israelis give up any dreams they have of dominating the Palestinians, the sooner we can have peace, two states living side by side, fully respecting each other because we are both groups of human beings and enjoy the human rights that come with that. Okay, so that's the end of this video. If you like what I do here, consider contributing to my Patreon, Shael Media. Still working on my trilogy of the 12 Tribes of Israel. That will be released in a few days. And see you here next time on Israel Explained.